January 2nd of 1995, a young couple drove out to Lake Juliet in Georgia. They turned down a narrow road and stopped on a thin stretch of land locals call the Point. But before the night was over, that peaceful spot would become the scene of a crime that puzzled investigators for nearly 2 years. Welcome to the Smoking Sun. If you're into true crime and sometimes creepy stories that are stranger than fiction, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because those are the kinds of stories I tell. Now, let's get into it. Grant Hendrickson was finishing a business degree at Mercer University in Macon. He was 22 and worked part-time at an electronics store while attending classes. His friends described him as someone who worked hard and didn't seek attention. He enjoyed hanging out with friends, football on the weekends, and getting in his car for long drives just to clear his head. His girlfriend, 19-year-old Michelle Cartagena, wanted to be a psychologist and took psychology courses at Mercer University. She had moved from a small Georgia town to enjoy the independence of living the college life. Her friends referred to her as warm and friendly, someone who noticed when someone felt left out and would bring them into the conversation. She loved coffee shops, thrift shopping, and small local concerts. College felt like a new beginning for her. The two had met each other the previous fall through mutual friends. Things started out casual, becoming study partners, and the more they began spending more time together, the closer they got. So by January, they were close and comfortable with each other, often taking the back roads, talking about school and the future, and sharing quiet evenings instead of big parties. On Monday evening, the night after they celebrated New Year's together, and with winter break almost over and classes about to start again, they decided to have one more romantic evening together. They grabbed food in Macon, drove down the highway with their favorite music playing, and looked for somewhere private to hang out. They eventually ended up at Lake Juliet, a quiet wooded lake about 25 minutes north. To them, it seemed perfect, just what they were looking for. Grant turned off the highway, steered onto the gravel lane, and parked on a narrow stretch of land near the water that locals called the Point. It was cold out, enough for a jacket, but not freezing. They turned the car off and sat there talking about winter break ending, what the next semester might be like, and just enjoying a quiet night alone. Around midnight, some campers on the other side of the lake heard gunfire. It started with a quick burst that sounded like a rifle, and then it went silent for a few seconds before they heard several handgun shots that followed. After that, they saw headlights come on and a car sped away. The next morning, a fisherman headed to the boat ramp and saw a car with its windows broken, sitting by itself. Inside, he saw a young man, bloodied, who was slumped over at the wheel. Outside, he saw a young woman covered in blood who was lying on the ground. He immediately left to call the police. A 911 dispatcher took the fisherman's call and sent deputies to the scene. The sheriff's deputies arrived at the scene soon after. They saw Grant sitting in the driver's seat and that he had been shot multiple times. He was pronounced dead at the scene. They also saw Michelle laying on the ground with obvious gunshot wounds to her back and her side. She too was pronounced dead at the scene. Her clothing had looked like it had been disturbed to look like a robbery, or possibly an assault. However, nothing looked to have been taken. They found two .23 rifle casings and 9mm pistol casings scattered around the scene. The deputies also noticed one particular clue. There was dried saliva mixed with tobacco spit on Michelle's leg. The scene left detectives puzzled. It looked like someone had planned it all out, but there was no clear reason why. The detectives threw everything they had at it. They canvassed every gun shop, every pawn log, and every firing range across Middle Georgia. They asked about AR-15 style rifles and 9mm pistols. They scoured the area surrounding the lake for tracks, dropped items or cigarette butts, and they tracked anyone that was known to chew tobacco. Now, DNA from the spit obviously existed, but in 1995 the technology was slow and the databases were minimal. You couldn't just run it through a national system like you can today. Early on in the investigation, they came across a quiet 20-year-old local kid named Andrew Cook. He was known to have owned an AR-15 and a 9mm pistol. They brought him in for questioning, but when asked about his firearms, he said he had sold his AR-15 several months before. They requested a DNA sample, but he refused to give them a sample without speaking to his father, who was a respected federal law enforcement agent. With Andrew not having any known connection to either Grant or Michelle, and with no probable cause to force a DNA test, nor anything tying him directly to the scene, investigators decided to move on. Besides, they had a working theory. This had to be personal, possibly jealousy or maybe revenge. Random killings happened, but rarely do they look this methodical. The detectives then talked to Kevin Branch. Michelle had dated Kevin the year before, and their breakup had been ugly. Not long before the murders, Kevin showed up at a party drunk and angry, telling people Michelle was making the mistake with Grant. He was a gun guy, always bragging about night shooting on his family's land. He also drove a dark hatchback similar to one a witness had described. Finally, it was a lead that felt solid. Detectives brought Kevin in. He sat for a long interview, had his cheek swabbed for DNA, and the detectives seized his AR-15. Kevin argued that he spent that evening at a friend's apartment drinking before he eventually crashed on the couch. But his story felt shaky. He didn't have much to prove where he'd been, and he couldn't remember the night clearly. That's when Randy Upton, a GBI agent, was brought in to lead the case, and he didn't like loose ends. He spent the next several days digging into Kevin's story by re-interviewing everyone who'd been at the party, checking his phone records, and even pulling security footage from stores near his apartment. Piece by piece, the story lined up. Multiple friends swore Kevin never left, and a late-night snack run receipt matched his timeline. Then forensic testing showed that his DNA didn't match, and neither did his rifle. This was their first real lead, and it went nowhere. After a few months went by, they came upon another name, Mark Eaton, a 24-year-old mechanic who lived nearby. Mark had a record for reckless shooting and once got into a nasty bar fight where police were called. His neighbors said he liked to park at the point and just drink. One neighbor even thought they had seen him leave late that night. Upton didn't waste time following up on the tip about Mark and brought him in for questioning. Mark started out very defensive, with his arms crossed and his answers short. He was clearly upset about being there. Upton pressed him further on where he'd been the night in question. He said he was helping a friend work on a truck and made a late run to an auto parts store to grab the part they needed. Then shortly after that, he headed home. When Upton pushed for details, the times, the names, and what parts they bought, Mark was fuzzy on the details and didn't have anything to show he was telling the truth. When he was asked about his guns, he agreed to let investigators take them for testing. But Upton didn't stop there. He called Mark's friend, checked his phone records, and tracked down a receipt from the parts store. And piece by piece the story lined up. The friend had confirmed Mark was there all night, the phone records fit, and the store receipt matched the time he claimed. Forensics came back clean too. The ballistics didn't match, and neither did the DNA. And once again, the lead went nowhere. For Upton, it was exhausting. Every time he thought a lead might go somewhere, the evidence or the timeline shut it down. Around Mercer, students gave up on the idea that someone would be arrested. Parents told their kids to stay away from the lake, but life mostly went on. For Grant's and Michelle's families, the holidays were nothing but another reminder of what they'd lost. By December 1996, nearly 2 years after the murders, the case was cold. But Upton couldn't let it go. Some cases just won't let you sleep, and this was one of them. He pulled the case file back out and started digging through it again, page by page. Interviews, gun sale records, pawn slips, every small lead. As he combed through the paperwork, certain things didn't line up anymore. Details that hadn't seemed important in the early days now felt off. Dates didn't quite match. A few statements looked different once he compared them to the hard records he now had. Upton and a partner decided to re-interview a particular individual, and what followed would finally break the case open. Here's what investigators believe happened on January 2nd, 1995. The killer drove alone to the lake that night with an AR-15 and a Ruger 9mm. He saw Grant's car parked and shut off his own engine. He walked up with the rifle and opened fire through the car, killing Grant instantly. Michelle tried to escape. He switched to the pistol and shot her. He then dragged her slightly and disturbed her clothing to make it look like an intimate attack or a robbery. Before leaving, he spat tobacco on her, an impulsive, careless act that would later undo him. The killer was Andrew Cook. Andrew Cook would tell his father, who in turn told Upton that he didn't know Grant or Michelle at all. What he was a young man who was angry at the world, fascinated by guns, and wanted to know what it would feel like to end the life of someone and get away with it. There was no grudge, no secret link. It was just a random act of violence. Cook was convicted on 2 counts of malice murder and 2 counts of felony murder, along with 1 count of armed robbery. He was sentenced to death, and after years of appeals, he was executed by lethal injection in February 2013. This story is based on real events. Some details and dialogue have been dramatized for clarity and storytelling purposes, but the core facts remain accurate. If you enjoyed the story, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to The Smoking Sun for more stories like this one. And if you're already subscribed, make sure you've clicked the bell and set it to all. That way you won't miss any of my uploads. Thanks for watching, and as always, see you next time.